Quiero agradecer la presencia de todos ustedes, en particular y en primer lugar al señor embajador de la India en México, el señor Sujan R.Chinoy, a quien le agradecemos muchísimo que haya aceptado nuestra invitación para estar hoy aquí para dialogar con ustedes. Agradezco la presencia también de la doctora Verónica Villarespe y su gran hospitalidad al recibirnos en este Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas. Agradezco la presencia de profesores distinguidos y de los alumnos de diversas cátedras de la universidad. Quisiera comentar, antes de dar la palabra a la profesora Wendy Phillips, para que haga la presentación, la introducción antes de la charla del señor embajador, que hemos dialogado esta mañana con él y con su equipo de colaboradores y que estamos iniciando un proceso de diálogo y de colaboración que deriva en colaboración con la India en temas de humanidades y de ciencias sociales. Hasta ahora, el vínculo que nuestra universidad tiene con universidades e instituciones culturales de la India se refiere esencialmente al área de ciencias, de ciencia y tecnología. Pero esperamos que a partir de ahora pueda hacerse efectiva la colaboración en temas de humanidades y de ciencias sociales. Y este es el propósito de esta conferencia que el señor embajador amablemente ha aceptado brindarnos. Así que yo le doy la bienvenida. Agradezco también la presencia como representante de la doctora Estela Morales Campos, coordinadora de Humanidades, al doctor Torres Salcido, que por aquí lo vi. Muchas gracias, profesor. Así que doy la palabra a la doctora Wendy Phillips para que haga la presentación. Y señor embajador, muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Muchísimas gracias.
In the name of Dr. Aurelia Vargas, I would like to thank the Institute of Philological Research for the organization of this event. To Dr. Verónica Villarespe, Director of the Institute of Economic Research, for her warm hospitality, and to all of you for your presence. It is a great pleasure for this university to welcome a very distinguished guest, His Excellency Mr. Sujan R.Chinoy, Ambassador of India to Mexico. The visit of Ambassador Chinoy has marked the beginning of what we are sure will become a close and fruitful friendship between our universities and the Indian government. This morning, we had the opportunity to discuss several issues of common interest in regards to the study of the humanities and social sciences, and we trust that such dialogues will meet a productive end. Ambassador Sujan Chinoy assumed the post of Ambassador of India to Mexico on August 2012. He began his diplomatic career in 1981, and he has specialized on China and the Asia-Pacific region. Apart from serving in the Indian missions in Hong Kong and Beijing in the 1980s, he was the Consul General of India in Shanghai between 2000 and 2005, and more recently, the Consul General of India in Sydney from 2006 to 2008. His other overseas assignments were in the Embassy of India in Saudi Arabia and at the Permanent Mission of India to the United Nations in New York. Ambassador Chinoy has also worked extensively on India's external trade and economic engagement. He contributed the chapter on economic diplomacy in China and Down Under in the book Economic Diplomacy, India's Experience, published in 2011. Before assuming the post of Ambassador of India to Mexico, Ambassador Chinoy was Additional Secretary in the National Security Council Secretariat in the Prime Minister's office in New Delhi, where he dealt with strategic policy and national security issues. He has lectured widely on strategic, defense, and economic issues at various institutions and think tanks in India and overseas. And thus, it is a real privilege to have him here today delivering a conference titled India and Mexico in a Changing World.
Well, muy Buenas tardes a todos. Yo soy embajador de la India en México. Solo tengo 6 meses en México. No puedo hablar muy bien español. Yo voy a hacer un discurso hoy en inglés. Espero la próxima vez pueda hablar español. Espero la próxima vez pueda hacer un discurso en español. So for today you'll have to bear with me in the English language. And let me therefore state at the very outset that I'm very grateful to all the eminent members of the faculty, Dr. Gerardo Torres Salcido, Doctora Verónica Villarespe Reyes, Dr. Leonardo Lomeli Vanegas, Dr. Jaime Ríos Ortega, Doctora Silvia Núñez Garcia, Doctora Alina Signoret Torcasbero, and not the least, Dr. Wendy Phillips, who has been instrumental, I must say, in actually getting me here. And I want to place on record my deep appreciation for all the good work that you've been doing with regard to India and with regard to building our bilateral relations over the years. It's a great privilege for me to be on the UNAM campus today. I've heard so much about this extremely famous educational institution, which has over the years produced a rich crop of scholars and students who have contributed to various walks of life in Mexico. We in India appreciate and realize the great importance of education. There is an ancient saying in Sanskrit, and I will simply give you the translation, that even a fool is worshipped in his own home. A king is worshipped in his kingdom. A village chieftain is always worshipped in his village. But a learned man, a scholar, a man of letters, of knowledge, is worshipped everywhere. In India, we have another saying, which when translated in English means that if you want returns in 1 year, you better invest in crops. If you want returns over 10 years, you could invest in fruit trees, for instance. But if you want returns over a much longer period, over 100 years, you should invest in human resources, in human beings, in people, in education, in the promotion of knowledge. So therefore it is in that context that I salute UNAM for the kind of work that it's been doing with regard to the spread of education and knowledge in Mexico. For me, it's a great privilege to be here as ambassador at this particular juncture in our bilateral relations. And let me at the very outset tell you that I come from a very interesting country. And for those of you who are not familiar, India is a large country like Mexico. It's an antipode. It's located exactly at the other side of the earth. If you were to dig a hole from Mexico down through to the other side, you will emerge in India. But India is not only a large country, as I said, it's the 7th largest country in the world. It has 1.2 billion people. That's 10 times the population of Mexico. It has a very ancient history. For those of you who are not familiar with India, Christianity, for instance, has a history going back to 48 AD in India. Long before many countries of Europe became Christian, India already hosted Christianity in 48 AD at the time of St. Thomas the Apostle. India has hosted Judaism since the fall of the Second Temple, and that's also almost 2,000 years. India is home to all the great religions of the world: Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam. India is the second largest population of Muslims anywhere in the world as part of our syncretic and composite culture. So when you look at India, you're looking at a very interesting country, a country which has 28 states and 7 union territories, a country which, when it conducts its general elections, you have something like 600 million voters. That's a mammoth exercise, the conduct of free and fair elections that we have in India. It's among the world's largest. So this is the kind of country that I represent, and for me, therefore, it's a great pleasure to be in a country with which I can relate. Because Mexico shares so much in common with India. Yo parezco mexicano. And la próxima vez, you can't tell the difference when I speak Espanol. But our deep civilizational links go back centuries, if not millennia. And it is for scholars like Dr. Wendy Phillips to examine what are these links over past centuries, over past millennia. For if we have, for instance, a much revered monkey god called Hanuman in India, you have, for instance, the god in your own Mayan and other ancient cultures called Hun Ahan. You have, for instance, in many of the local cultures, the worship of the serpent called Quetzalcoatl. In India too, we have similar worship systems in ancient times. How many of you know, for instance, that the bandana that you so fondly wear, the paliacate, how many of you know that it has an Indian link? The word paliacate comes from the word palicat. And palicat is an adaptation of the word Calicut. Calicut is a famous port in southern India which was visited by Vasco da Gama, I think in 1498. And it is Calicut that's famous for its cotton handkerchiefs and bandanas, which today have the same prints that exist on the Mexican bandanas. And it is through that trade between ancient India and the Philippines, which was under King Philip of Spain at that time, and then on to Nueva España, which was Mexico, that you have these links that have developed without our even realizing that there is so much in common. How many of you have heard, for instance, of the story of Catarina de San Juan of Puebla? She is, according to Mexican scholars, a very famous saintly figure in Mexico, known for her visions, known for her art, which even today is reproduced in many famous churches and cathedrals in Mexico. And according to historical records, according to her own Mexican biographers, some of whom were her confessors, she originated from Mughal India. And she was taken to a port in southern India by pirates, and then to the Philippines. She converted to Catholicism and then brought to Mexico. So, please examine these things a little more. What is the connection between India and Mexico? The purpose of my talk today, of course, is to give you a more contemporary view of what is happening in Mexico, how do we relate that to what is happening in India, and what is the context today in which countries like India and Mexico see themselves as they develop and as they progress into the 21st century. The first point is that the global scenario is changing. It is changing not only for us individually, it is changing in our regions, and it is changing at the global level. And it is this changing context that places a number of challenges upon us. It also brings a number of opportunities to our doorstep. And in order to avail of these opportunities and make the most countries like India and Mexico have to adapt themselves in terms of their societies, in terms of their politics, and in terms of their economics. At the global level, it is very clear, for instance, that political and economic power is today fragmented and fractured like never before. Gone are the days when single countries could, for instance, dictate terms or decide everything. Today it is a much more consultative world. With two financial crises in less than 5 years, for instance, both Europe and the United States have experienced economic downturns and are unlikely, by all current evidence, to recover anytime soon. And these were the regions that provided the traditional engines, the traditional power to economic growth and momentum at the global level. Europe has to build internal consensus, for instance, particularly with Germany, to deal with the fiscal crisis in Greece, Portugal and Spain, a crisis that is now spreading and casting a shadow on others as well. GDP growth rates, for instance, in Europe are not likely to recover anytime soon, with the exception of Germany perhaps. And the US is also grappling with its own high unemployment rates, trade deficit, and less than 2% growth in the economy. Generally speaking, one can say, when we look at these global changes, that something extraordinary has happened in the last 30, if not the last 20 years. Economic growth engines, which traditionally lay in Europe and the United States and elsewhere, have shifted in recent years to the Asia-Pacific region. China, for instance, as you all know, has grown at an unbridled pace of more than 9% for many years. For almost 20 to 25 years, China has grown at about 9%. But there are other emerging economies as well. Economies like India, Indonesia, Singapore, in Asia, that have also made very good progress. And for the first time, after a gap of 200 years, Asia has risen in terms of its economic progress and potential. For 200 years, large countries like China and India had found their potential thwarted by colonialism, exploitation, unequal trade arrangements, etc. But Asia today, with the shifting fulcrum of economic growth moving to that part of the world, Asia is once again on the rise. And Asia is home to 60% of the global population. And for the first time in history, after a gap of 200 years, a full 60% of the global population is being exposed to an average of 6% GDP growth rates. I think that is extraordinary. It is extraordinary in terms of the far-reaching changes that this kind of growth and exposure to growth of 60% of mankind or humankind will have in the years to come. But that does not mean, for instance, that the current crisis in the Eurozone has left any country untouched. Even India, even China has been affected, for instance, by the current economic challenge. As our Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh said recently, in November 2012, the global economy is under stress. Growth rates have slowed down everywhere. There is considerable uncertainty about the period over which growth will revive in the industrialized world. Even the juggernaut of the Chinese economy has experienced a considerable slowdown, with growth estimates for China now around 7.5%, as against the almost double-digit growth of the past decade. And this has affected and will continue to affect many other countries, especially those that have a strong exposure to China. Those that till now, for instance, in the last 10 years, were riding high on account of the great demand for natural resources and energy in China. But at 7.5% or perhaps lower, it will be impossible to keep up that kind of a demand. So countries that had an exposure to China on natural resources and energy alone, and not on manufactured goods, they are likely to feel the effects of this slowdown. When China sneezes, for instance, countries in the region like Brazil may catch a cold. They may experience a certain slowdown in their own economies, and this is natural. Even if the Chinese economy picks up momentum again, and we all hope it does, it will be very difficult for China to regain the double-digit growth rates that it experienced in the last decade. In Latin America, something fundamental is happening. The long-term bets, for instance, even my long-term bets, are on your country, on Mexico, on Mexico's rise. And much is already being talked about in this context. Already, Mexico is the largest trading nation in the world, in this part of the world, in Latin America. Mexico's exposure to East Asia is, in a sense, minimal, because it has an adverse balance of trade with countries like China, for instance. It has not been selling energy or raw materials to the same extent. It's been buying a lot. So it's unaffected by a slowdown, for instance, in China. And Mexico's trillion-dollar economy is growing at about 4% this year. And next year's prognosis is even higher. Moreover, I think with the US placing renewed importance on reviving domestic manufacturing, more investment is likely to chase lower wages that prevail in the border regions between Mexico and the United States, especially on the Mexican side. And it's no wonder, therefore, that people are already talking about and writing about the rise, the renewed rise of the maquiladoras in northern Mexico. If China, for instance, were a factor 10 years ago in bringing about an erosion of Mexico's manufacturing capabilities because of its high volume, low cost production model and lower wages, today, once again, China is emerging as a factor in Mexico's rise, because wages are rising once again in China. If China had a 1:5 advantage 10 years ago in terms of costs of manufacturing, particularly wages, today that gap is only 15%. And that 15% is perhaps offset by the long distance that goods must travel from China to the North American continent. And therefore, there is a discernible and perceptible shift towards greater investment in Mexico for certain sectors. For heavy equipment, power equipment, in the aviation industry, investment is moving back to Mexico to avail of the excellent supply chains that have been developed on the North American continent between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Not the least because of NAFTA and because of the kind of integration that you had with NAFTA over the years. As our Prime Minister has recently stated, the Indian economy has also been affected. Our exports have shrunk. India has about $300 billion worth of exports. And we import about $450 billion worth of imports. We therefore have a problem with a current account deficit. And this is explained by the large quantities of energy and crude that India must import. Unlike Mexico, we are not self-sufficient in energy. Even in your case, you produce a great deal of crude, but you do not have enough refining capacity. We buy some of your crude, but we have excess refining capacity back in India. We convert your crude into petroleum products and sell it back to Mexico. Some of the petrol that you use may in fact have been processed in India's refinery. In India's case, Our growth, which was riding high, even after the second global economic and financial crisis, India had bounced back with 8% growth rates. And we've been doing well for the last 15 to 20 years in this regard, averaging 6% or more. But even our growth slowed down to 6.5% in 2011, and 2012 ended with about 5.4%, which may appear very good when compared to the other growth rates that we see of barely 1% or 2% elsewhere. But it's not enough for a large country like India that needs to create the right kind of employment generated through rapid economic growth. And the social transformation that we wish to achieve is also a very major objective, to see that the largest number of people possible are pulled out of poverty, and to ensure that these large numbers in India can avail of the same prosperity as others have access to in India, the same opportunities and the same chance to progress and do well in life. But modern India is a resilient nation. If anything, India is a very resilient country. It will bounce back. Despite the challenging global economic environment, it is creditable that in the year 2012, as I said, we ended with about 5.4% growth. And barring any unexpected shocks, in 2013-14, the fiscal year 13-14, we will see India getting back to about 7% growth rate. In 2014 and 15, we are optimistic about getting back to 8% growth rate. We still have to grapple with high average inflation of about 7.8% and a high budget deficit also. These are challenges, along with the deficit on the current account that I mentioned to you. And we will have to work much harder at a time when the global economy has slowed down, at a time when large economies like the United States and the large economies of the European Union will not be able to consume the same amount in terms of imports from countries like India. We will have to work harder to look for new markets for our products. And this is where countries like Mexico, as part of the Latin American region and the Caribbean region, will figure. This is where a continent like Africa will figure in our strategic economic outlook for the future. We are very optimistic, not the least because the fundamentals in the Indian economy are very good. We have excellent human resources, an excellent scientific and technological foundation. We have excellent centers of higher learning. And more recently, the government in India bit the bullet and has carried out many reforms which will have far-reaching consequences for the better in terms of inviting foreign direct investment, investments in the multi-brand retail sector, aviation industry, power, even the financial services sector, such as insurance, are expected to pick up as a result of these fundamental reforms, far-reaching reforms that have been carried out. We will fast-track all this. Over the next 5 years, India is expected to spend upwards of $1 trillion on infrastructure alone between 2012 and 2017. That's our 12th five-year plan. We will spend so much of money on infrastructure to improve ports, airports, roads, etc. And here too, I think, countries like Mexico will have an opportunity to participate. The Indian market, mind you, is one of the largest in the world. Over the years, because of the economic progress that we have achieved in the last 2 decades, we have, for instance, created a very large middle class. A middle class that numbers about 300 million people. And they have increasing spending power, purchasing power, which will drive demand in India and be a positive vector in our economic growth and progress. What is more, and this is a very important part of what I have to say to you today, that India has excellent human resources. And like all the young people that I encounter here today, India has large numbers of the youth. A full 50% of our population in India that's about 600 million people, are below the age of 25. A full 70% of India's large population of 1.2 billion people is below the age of 40. And these age groups are important because this is the age group, the working age group of people where the youth in India, provided it is properly trained and equipped with education, can become a very positive force in the economic requirements of the nation in years to come. And this is happening at a time when the rest of the world seems to be grappling with the problem of an aging population. The rest of the developed world, for instance, is already facing a very clear challenge in terms of its demographics. It is estimated that by 2020, the US will be short of 17 million people of the working age. That's just 8 years from now. You're going to have these kinds of demands and non-availability of human resources. Japan will have a shortage of 9 million people in the working age group. Russia by 6 million. And at the same time, India will have a surplus of 47 million people in the working age group. So even when compared to developing countries like Brazil, for instance, we are doing much better on the human resources front. Brazil's working population is set to grow by about 12%. China's by only 1%. They are also facing the problem of an aging population. And there are Chinese scholars who say that China could well age before it really gets rich. But it is countries like India, which have a very youthful population, that have the potential to last the course. And it's a long haul when you look at the next 30 or 40 years. And this is the reason why Goldman Sachs, for instance, predicted that only India can maintain a 5% growth rate until 2050, if you go by the demographics and the availability of this demographic dividend that we are speaking of. As far as India and Mexico are concerned, as I said at the very outset, I'm very optimistic. We have concluded what is called the privileged partnership between India and Mexico. This was done in 2007 during President Calderon's administration. Since then, a number of high-level visits have taken place. Our president visited Mexico on a return visit in 2008. More recently, last year, we had Dr. Manmohan Singh visit Mexico for the G20 summit. And these high-level visits have added fresh impetus to our bilateral ties. I have no doubt that during the new administration of President Peña Nieto, we will see more visits, we will see greater engagement. This is the sentiment that I'm experiencing whenever I engage people in the Mexican government. India attaches great importance to its relations with this region, with the entire Latin American and the Caribbean. Our trade and investment in this part of the world is quite high. We have roughly $25 billion worth of trade with the Latin American region. Mexico, of course, is considered part of the NAFTA region back home in India as well, for obvious reasons. We have $16 billion worth of investments in the Latin American and the Caribbean region, including in energy projects, in large-scale energy projects. As ambassador, I'd like to see some of that outbound investment from India come to Mexico as well. For us, Mexico is a very important player. Our bilateral trade is now a considerable sum. In 2011, it was $4.15 billion. But what is even more important is that it's been growing at 48% year on year. And when the final statistics pour in for the last year, 2012, especially for the last quarter, we are likely to see a quantum jump in our bilateral trade, and perhaps we will register a bilateral trade figure of roughly $6 billion or close to that in 2012. And what's even better is that our bilateral trade is evenly matched. It's not lopsided. Neither side has an adverse balance of trade. It is so evenly matched, and that demonstrates to us that there are complementarities in the two economies that we can increasingly exploit to our advantage, to our mutual advantage. We export a great deal of chemicals, petrochemicals, engineering goods, even automobiles. You are aware of the fact, for instance, that the Bajaj brand of motorcycles from India is selling in Mexico. Even the Royal Enfield, which is a much bigger bike, now has a showroom here in Mexico. And one of our best known cars, which is the world's smallest car called the Nano, which is also the world's cheapest car, I'm told. I'm told that there are Mexican importers who are interested in bringing this car to Mexico. So we're likely to see more of this. Our pharmaceutical sector, for instance, is doing very well in Mexico. And but for certain regulatory issues and challenges with regard to bioequivalence and testing, etc., but for the fact that we don't have an FTA and that all our products are subject to high duty structures, we would have done even better. And perhaps you might have benefited much more, considering that Indian pharmaceutical products are world-class, they're competitive, and they're much cheaper than anything that any multinational corporation can sell to you. But that's a different story. But why we must engage more and why we must start a dialogue, if not on a free trade agreement, at least on a preferential trade agreement. For these dialogues take a long time to come to fruition. The gestation period is long, and we must begin this kind of a discourse and dialogue. We have large numbers of delegations coming in. I visited Guadalajara in the month of January to inaugurate the Indian pavilions at Intermoda, which is a fashion show focusing on fashion products and textiles. And it was very heartening to see 30 to 40 Indian exhibitors and stalls out there. You too have a number of iconic companies that are already in India, like for instance Cinepolis from Morelia. They have 65 cinema screens in India, a complete theatre concept of this type, where you have seating, where you have screens, all owned by Cinepolis. And they have 300 more in the pipeline. For the next 10 years, Cinepolis, I'm told, will base its growth strategy on just one country, India, picking up all the slack. That is the size of the Indian market for Cinepolis. And companies like Omex, for instance, are already in the construction sector. My own housing minister, Minister for Housing and Poverty Alleviation, was here recently in Mexico. He had excellent meetings with Ms. Robles in regard to poverty alleviation and with Mr. Ramirez Marin in regard to your experience in the informal and formal housing sector policies. And I think there are immense opportunities for both sides to collaborate here. For India, it's particularly important to engage Mexico, as I said, not the least because the long-term bets are on Mexico, and not the least because you are the largest trading nation in Latin America, but also because you have those 44 FTAs with many countries. And therefore, having a presence here for an Indian global company is like having an opportunity to access many other countries and their markets. This is the message that I give to Indian companies in order to encourage their presence and their investment in Mexico. Mexico has also done exceedingly well in terms of agriculture. Now, I've noted, for instance, that a full 28% of Mexico's GDP, manufacturing GDP, comes from the agriculture sector. So you obviously have a very well-developed agro-processing sector. This is something of great interest to a country like India, which has an enormous part of its population, roughly 70%, depending on agriculture, even today. Although agriculture, as a quantum of our GDP, is much less, the sheer number of people that depend on agriculture in India is huge. And it is agriculture, therefore, that provides sustenance to a large majority of the Indian population. Mexico has already played a wonderful role in India's agriculture in the past. And as I was informing you a while ago, in the 1970s, for instance, 60s and 70s, we had what was called the Green Revolution in India, which made India self-sufficient in food production. And it was the Sonora variety of wheat from Mexico, called Sonora. The appellation comes from its provincial origins in Sonora province in Mexico, that made this possible in India. So that is the kind of linkage that already exists, and the kind of linkage that must be promoted. We therefore have a very bright future in terms of the opportunities that exist in the future for both of us. We have a number of dialogues in place. We have what is called the high-level group for economic cooperation, investment, which took place in India in October last year. And a number of subgroups have already been formed to identify areas where we can move forward rapidly. We also have a regular dialogue between the foreign offices, between the SRE and the Ministry of External Affairs in India, what we call the Foreign Office consultations or the high-level meetings between our ministers. So there is every reason for us to be optimistic about our economic engagement, particularly since we already have in place arrangements like the double taxation avoidance agreement, the bilateral investment promotion and protection agreement. These are already in place. And as recently as in October last year, we have concluded, and the Mexican Senate has already approved, the bilateral agreement signed between India and Mexico in customs cooperation. And that is why I am very optimistic about the future of our economic relations. Mexico is looking afresh at the Asia-Pacific region. You have recently got on board the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I think this is also with a view to broadening your own economic engagement at the global level. But in Asia, you have only one FTA, whereas you have a total of 44 free trade agreements, only one in Asia, that's with Japan. And you have two seemingly in the pipeline with the Republic of Korea and I think an aborted attempt to have an FTA with Singapore in the past. But I think you need many more FTAs. And I think you need an FTA with countries like India as well. Which is why I want to re-emphasize that point about commencing some kind of a dialogue on preferential trade agreement or a free trade agreement. In the information age, in the digital age that we live in today, passwords are more important than passports. As Thomas Friedman, not George Friedman, all the Friedmans have something to say about the world. There are three, right? Beginning with Milton Friedman, we teach you all about the economics that guide us, and then you have Thomas Friedman, who wrote The World is Flat, and then of course you have Mr. George Friedman of Stratford, who also writes about India, Mexico, the rise of the emerging economies. But you're aware of the fact that Thomas Friedman, the US economist, has written a book, a well-known book called The World is Flat. And indeed, the world is flat today. It's competitive, it's far more compacted, it's a level playing field where opportunities abound, not just for the entrenched economic powers of the past, but also for the potential economic powers of the future, the emerging economies like India and Mexico. What happens today in one part of the world affects others, no matter how far or how distant you are in geographic terms. We are essentially, in this information age, close neighbors, no matter where we are. And that's the kind of flow that we see of trade, investment, and human resources in a globalized economy. Both India and Mexico, therefore, have a great chance for achieving success in the 21st century, the language barriers notwithstanding. And I should like to see, for instance, Indians use more Spanish, including to promote their economic objectives in Mexico. And I'd certainly like to see Mexico also use a little more English to engage with the outside world. So we'll learn more Spanish, and I hope you'll also learn more English. And this will help us to bridge the communication gap. Está muy importante para promover vinculación entre México y India. Muy importante para comunicar mejor entre todos los países. So much for my Spanish. And we, as I said at the outset, we have much in common. We have to rediscover each other. We have to generate that kind of passion and interest in the youth, including in UNAM, including among research scholars, to reach out to one another. We want to see more visits between India and Mexico, including at the level of the youth. The future is bright. Mexico wants to grow to its full potential. So does India. You cannot do it without looking at closer economic ties with the emerging economies in Asia, including India. We cannot do it alone. We cannot do it without building deeper engagement with Latin America, particularly with Mexico. Thank you very much.
Señor embajador, personas que nos acompañan, académicos, alumnos, directores, muchas gracias por su presencia. Señor embajador, muchas gracias por su generoso tiempo para mostrar lo que es la cultura de la India y las coincidencias que hay con la nuestra. Quisiera decirles que en la charla que tuvimos previamente, antes de llegar a este auditorio, le hemos planteado a él que nos apoye para gestionar la posibilidad de abrir en la UNAM, entre la UNAM y las instituciones de la India, la cátedra Mahatma Gandhi. Esa es una de las propuestas que hemos hecho. Hemos recibido de él la promesa de plantearlo ante las instancias gubernamentales correspondientes, así que yo le agradezco doblemente esta posibilidad. Es una idea que hemos conversado también desde nuestro instituto con otros institutos, con directores de otros institutos y de otros centros de investigación de la UNAM en el ámbito de las humanidades y las ciencias sociales. Así que abrigamos la esperanza de esa posibilidad. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros.
Muchísimas gracias a todos.